All right, Alexander, let's talk about such an interesting topic, Evergrande and China and the Chinese economy. This has really put the Chinese economy into focus. And I've read a lot of analysis on the Chinese economy, and I'll tell you, it's going from the Chinese economy is fine and nothing's going to bring it down to the Chinese economy is collapsing. It's a paper tiger economy. The thing's just going to crumble with Evergrande. I've also heard the same thing. Evergrande is not contagious. There's not going to be contagion from the Evergrande. And then I've heard if Evergrande falls, well, Lehman Brothers event, the whole thing falls apart. Just in literally 20 minutes ago, before we did the video, there is a story from Reuters which is saying that China tells Evergrande to avoid dollar bond defaults. Bloomberg reports. So we had news that Evergrande is going to make their payments in time. It sent the shares surging 32%. The Fed Chair Powell said that the U.S. is not really that exposed to it, and investors shouldn't worry a Lehman moment. But Alexander, what do you think is going on with Evergrande? What's the Chinese party? What is Xi Jinping? What is his position on Evergrande? And just give us an overall kind of viewpoint as to where you believe the Chinese economy is at this moment.
Yeah, I think it is in a period of transition. I think it's going to be a very tricky transition. And I think this Evergrande affair is actually big and serious. I don't think it's existential in the way that the Lehman crisis almost was. But I don't think one should underestimate its seriousness. If you look at what the big growth drivers in China have been over the last couple of years, I mean, I'm talking about last 10 years or so, it's not been manufacturing. I mean, manufacturing growth in China has been enormous, and it's built up a huge industrial and manufacturing base, but that has, to some extent, reached almost saturation levels. What has enabled China to keep growing at 10% a year is not growing its manufacturing. It is doing two things. It is building lots of property and stimulating a big property bubble, and at the same time engaging in a simply gigantic infrastructure program. Now, the problem is that the infrastructure program is leaving lots of China with more infrastructure than China needs. And I saw this myself. I remember when I went to China in 2017 and, passing through, some very small towns and villages in China, practically villages in China, and you see these gigantic railway stations there, such as in Europe you'd see in a great city. And it seemed to me, totally disproportionate to what was actually needed. It was massive overinvestment and malinvestment in certain places in terms of infrastructure. And in terms of property, all that enormous increase in property, building, construction, and all the rest, which is what's, by the way, been sucking raw materials into China. They need steel, they need timber, they need all those things in order to build all those buildings. All of that is now, and has been for some time, creating a property bubble. And I think this is right, Evergrande is right at the center of this. It's the side of China that is reflected in the big property bubble. And it's one of China's big property companies. And I think what has happened is that the people in the Chinese government, obviously Xi Jinping himself, but people in the Central Bank of China and others, have been increasingly concerned that this property bubble would sooner or later burst, and it's getting out of control. And over the last couple of months, they've been working to try to deflate it. But that bubble has risen to such a level that deflating the bubble is proving incredibly difficult. And we've seen that Evergrande has almost collapsed. And now what we see is that because of the effect on China's international reputation and on the stability of its economy and its larger economic position, the Chinese government has been forced, in effect, to bail out Evergrande. And that's what this announcement that came out 20 minutes ago really says. Because how will Evergrande honour its dollar bonds? Well, it can only do so through backing from the Chinese government. Now, I don't think this is an existential moment because the Chinese government has immensely deep pockets. It's got the largest international reserves by far in the world. It's got also enormous internal reserves in China. The Chinese people are massive savers, so I think they can cover all these problems. But what it does show, to my mind, is that the Chinese model of growth that has been followed for the last 10 years, infrastructure spending and the property bubble, have almost reached the point of exhaustion, and they can't be sustained anymore. So I think we're going to see this thing managed, but I'm pretty confident that at the end of it, we're going to see Chinese economic growth fall. So theoretically, it's around 6%. I suspect it's probably around 4%. In reality, it might even dip below that. Maybe we'll see growth at a much more mature, sustainable level of 3% over the next few years. So the epic era of double-digit growth in China is now coming to an end.
Yeah, what does it tell you about China's future when you see that the Chinese people are buying properties now, not with savings, but with debt? They're buying multiple properties with debt. And I think that's a big change. Instead of just saying, I have enough money to buy one apartment, one flat, one home, I'm going to buy 3 or 4 homes, and 2 of those homes I'm going to service with debt. That's a huge problem. But what does it tell you what does it tell you about the economy that you're starting to see that you are seeing that in large numbers, and that's part of the bubble? And number 2 is, what does it tell you about the Chinese economy when you look at a company like Evergrande, a huge company, an important company, but a company that was in property development and construction of properties, reach a point where it realized it wasn't going to drive profits and growth anymore in that sector, and it started to overreach, and it got overambitious, and that's how it ended up in this problem. It started to build cars, it started to build health centers, amusement parks, all kinds of stuff, and it was servicing all of that with debt. I mean, it just got way ambitious, and almost in an effort to try and find growth, where they realized there wasn't any growth left, or at least the growth they were used to in the property side of things. It's like they took a ton of money, $300 billion. They said, you know what, let's throw it against the wall at all these different industries that we perceive as high growth, electric cars and all this stuff, and maybe we're going to hit upon that next big thing. Yeah,
it's growth at any cost, and that is always disastrous for any economy that pursues it. I think one of the big changes that's happened in China this year, and this is partly the explanation for all these economic reforms that the Chinese government has been doing, is that suddenly, finally, the penny dropped with them, that if they pursue this policy of growth at any cost, they're ultimately going to lead China to some kind of financial crash. And I think they've probably just reined in time. But growth at any cost is always, invariably, a totally misguided, it's a wrong strategy. It creates massive imbalances within an economy. The reason why there's been this massive property bubble in China is because the Chinese government was inflating the Chinese economy all the time. It was allowing this property bubble to grow because the property bubble was providing China with that double-digit growth, or what it was able to claim was that double-digit growth. So the Chinese were doing that, and they've now understood that this is impossible and that it's unsustainable, and they're trying to find a way of deflating it without causing massive problems for the economy as a whole. But the thing, and the reason you get companies like Evergrande behaving like that is because, of course, they've also been infected with the fantasies of the bubble. The idea that, they've got to find means to sustain growth at absurd levels, impossible levels, and they've invested in all sorts of things instead of operating their core business responsibly and intelligently. You can't do this forever. China has now discovered, finally, this year, that it can't, and we'll see whether or not how well they manage the transition. Either they will succeed and do it, in which case, we'll have 3 to 4% sustainable growth in China for the next 10 years, and that's good growth, and it would lead China to grow and the Chinese people to see a more prosperous life, or we will see the Chinese government mismanage it, in which case we will see economic stagnation, as we saw in Japan, or we will see a total crash, as we saw at the end of the Soviet Union in Russia. I don't believe the last, by the way. I think the Chinese know very well the dangers of going down that particular road. I think there is a possibility that if they mismanage this, they could go the way of Japan and end up in a kind of stagnation trap. But they're aiming and working towards getting this under control without falling into that trap now. And, maybe they'll manage it, maybe they won't. We'll just have to wait and see.
Final question. What are the effects for the rest of the world, specifically the United States, if China starts to starts to taper down to a 3% growth? What does it mean for other economies? Their growth also is going to take a hit if they don't adjust.
Absolutely. And here I think I have to say something to some of our American viewers. I know a lot of Americans get very, spooked by the fact that China's been growing at 10% and want to see growth rates in China fall. Always be careful what you wish for. That's always what I tell people, because, of course, one of the reasons why the United States has been able to live so far beyond its means, which it has done. It's currently running a 15% a budget deficit of 15% of GDP. It's been printing money for so many years. We have quantitative easing after quantitative easing. The reason it's been able to do that for so long without seeing inflation, take off, is because it's been able to import cheap goods from China. And the reason it's been able to import cheap goods from China, because China growth machine has been working in an overdrive to provide those goods. The Chinese economy slows, and the Chinese have less ability, if you like, to continue exporting and to crank up their exports, then of course that will mean that the United States will not be able to conduct that kind of fiscal and monetary policy to the extent that it has been doing over the last few years. It's going to have to adjust to that reality. That's going to bring American growth rates down unless the United States is prepared to risk much higher inflation than it's, I think, prepared to do. So what we see already is talk from the Federal Reserve Board. I don't know how serious it is, but they're talking about raising interest rates. They might even do it, finally, but whether they want to or not, I suspect that before very long, the growth slowdown in China means that they will have to do it, at which point, by the way, we will see lower growth everywhere, including the United States, and dare I say it, that's probably in some ways a not entirely bad thing, because if it means that economies can balance and we can return to some kind of reality, and perhaps we start seeing growth in the United States, which is more based on, internal dynamics rather than globalization and chimerica and all of that, well, that could be good for the United States in the long term. Just as real growth at 3% is better for China than inflationary or debt-driven bubble growth at 6%. Growth numbers, these high GDP growth numbers that politicians love, are ultimately a road to disaster. The only people who seem to understand that for the moment are the Russians, who avoided falling into those kind of traps. And I think if the Chinese and the Americans come down to earth, that's better for all of us.
All right. We'll leave it there. We'll monitor this story closely. Guys, go to the Duran.locals.com. You'll find a link down below. Please join us there. Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code RealNews and Super U Rumble, BitChute, and Odyssey. You'll find all our videos there. Take care.